Oh, my name is Sterling Holy White Mountain. I got my undergraduate, I got my BA in English Creative Writing here about, I don't know, a long time ago it seems like now. And then I got my MFA in fiction from the University of Iowa, where Charlie was my teacher for a semester. I had intended to get some pretty cool quotes of his, which I didn't do, and this is gonna be more organized than it's turning out to be. But the one thing I really wanted was that I couldn't find, because I don't have a copy of the book, and is the 2007 O. Henry Prize story collection that I don't know if it was a foreword or an afterword that Charlie wrote in there, but he said some pretty extraordinary things in there about his relationship to words and language, and but I could not find a copy of that, so you guys are just gonna have to go find it for yourselves. We'll get some what good is an introduction if I don't send you on some kind of quest, right? Some details. Charles D'Ambrosio grew up in Seattle, Washington. He attended Oberlin College, got his MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop, and I'm going to continue to sweat like this the entire time, so I'm just apologizing now. Where he got his MFA in fiction from the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he is currently on faculty. Previously, he was on the faculty of Portland State University's MFA program in creative writing, and he also has been a visiting instructor at the Tin House Summer Writers Workshop and the Warren Wilson MFA program for writers. He has published 2 collections of short stories. The first was The Point, second The Dead Fish Museum, that was 2006, which was a finalist for the PEN/Faulkner Award. 2 collections of essays, the first being Orphans, which is now out of print, and it was a fairly limited print run, and I know that it went officially out of print and unavailable actually that semester that he was teaching at Iowa in 2008, that fall, because I remember when all the copies disappeared from the Prairie Lights bookstore, and that was when you could no longer buy it on Amazon either, but luckily all those essays are on Loitering now, which just came out last year. Let's see, along with some other new essays in this new collection. He has published work in The New Yorker, Paris Review, Zoetrope, and The Stranger, among many others. He has received a Whiting Award, an Academy Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, Lannan Foundation Fellowship, and was a USA, I believe Rasmussen Fellow. So I'm just going to talk about a couple of things. I know that the thing is that I don't really want to talk about the writing very much, because I think you should all just go read it. I love his work, but I think that something that I was thinking about in particular as it came time to introduce him was the endings of some of his stories and his essays, and I'm trying to remember. I think I must have read The Dead Fish Museum in 2007 or 2008, and I still think regularly about the ending of Up North and the ending of Screenwriter, both of which end on pretty extraordinary images that are undeniable in a way that's hard to describe. Obviously, I think all the time about his incredible analysis, critical analysis of Degrees of Grey in Philipsburg, in which he manages to connect Richard Hugo's famous poem to 9/11, Falling Man, existential despair, or at least existential contemplation, among other things. And of course there is his essay Documents, which is possibly the most powerful 11 pages of prose I've ever read, and about which I will say nothing else and just say again, read it. When I was his student at Iowa, there was a moment where the first time I sat down for a one-on-one talk with him about my first story there, and I realized that he was taking my work more seriously than I was. And I thought that I was taking my work seriously. And then I realized that there was another level of seriousness that I had never seen before. And I was embarrassed, of course. But it's one of those moments of embarrassment that I'm actually very, very glad for. There was also that published story that woman turned in, and without telling us that it was published, and she was she wasn't very happy when her story got taken apart in class, and she didn't return to class that particular class that semester. And I kind of feel like that's either the moral of that story is either don't turn in a published story to workshop, or don't turn in a published story to Charlie's workshop. I don't know which one it is. One of the most important things I think I learned from him while I was his student was that he showed me in some way that is very difficult to describe how to read myself, which was really a way of paying attention to my own mind and what was going on in my mind while I was working, actually, as opposed to just what was on the paper afterwards. And to notice the moments when I was trying not to write what I knew I had to write. And that was a pretty big deal for me. I also recall the moment when he told someone at some point that the longest he had ever spent on a single story was 12 years. And I was like, that was when I was like, I don't know if this is what I signed up for, but here I am, and it wasn't just me either, it was a lot of my friends that were in his workshop, and those moments of I don't know what you would call them, revelation, of things that we still talk about when we get a chance to talk on the phone. What it said to me, though, was that there was, in the same way that I realized he was taking my own work more seriously than I was, he was also showing us a level of commitment and patience to how to have a level of commitment and patience to your own work that is fundamentally, I think, about the quality of the work above all other things. And as far as like a workshop instructor, you always hear your instructors talk about how important doubt is in being able to move through doubt while you're writing and writing not knowing where you're going. But he was the first teacher I ever had who actually allowed doubt to be part of the teaching process in the room, and that was revelatory. And this is something that I don't remember, that's a lot at this point in time, like I feel like I remember him saying things, but maybe I just remember him saying things and he didn't actually say them. But since I'm the one at the mic, you guys have to listen to my interpretation anyway. One of the things I learned from him as a student was I got the sense that that what we were here to do was to make art, and that we were not here to try to solve problems. And I think you can see that when you read the quotes that I was going to find and read to you guys that I didn't get. That's in there. But I think the quote from that New York Times, I think it was the interview for Loitering. It was an interview or a review, and Charlie's quote in there was that instead of sobbing, you write, and that was that I think kind of sums up what I'm talking about. Let's see. Let's finish this up. About his essays, since he's going to be reading essays tonight, or parts of essays. There's a way in which his essays in particular become the kind of self-aware examination of whatever subject he happens to be considering, that refuses to take shortcuts or make excuses. And given how much of this world is a lie, and given that we are all liars in one way or another, which is probably okay, this kind of examination of both self and subject is, in my estimation, invaluable. Art is the one place we can go for honesty, as far as I can tell, and there's an honesty present in his work that I believe is rare. A couple other quotes here. A couple years ago, I had the chance to sit down for coffee with him in Portland, and I have no idea what I was doing in Portland, which I kind of feel is how most people in Portland feel. And we were talking about, and I think I asked him something like, how do you write a novel? and the process of writing a novel, and he said, I think you should lose yourself in the writing of a novel so the reader can lose him or herself in the process of reading the novel. And the last thing I'm going to say is the first time I ran into Charlie was actually I was at the University of Michigan for 1 year, And I don't know if anybody knows anything about that place. I'm not the biggest fan, but that's just me. And there's this thing called the Hopwood Room that they have there, which is the most pretentious room I've ever been in related to literary things. And they have this big round table there with about 300 or so literary journals on top of the table, and and you can't even really use the table. It's almost like, I don't know what that's about. And and at that time, it was everybody's first semester, and I know that I don't think it's something that's peculiar to, I think it's probably pretty typical for most MFA programs, regardless of where they are or how old or young they are. When people first get into MFA programs, there's always a lot of talk about publishing, and as if publishing is going to solve your problem, and I remember one of my cohorts saying, like asking him some kind of question about publishing and the process, like where were you sending your stuff out when you first were trying to get published, and what is it that et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he just stopped and he said, look at this table, and he pointed to these literary journals, and he said, anyone can publish. That's not what we're trying to do. Ladies and gentlemen, Charlie D'Ambrosio.
Thank you. First of all, it's great to be here. But thank you, Sterling. Last night I went to, and I'm going to have to stop talking about this. I was so knocked out by the thing I went to with a panel with Sterling and Stephen Graham Jones and Ten Van Alst. It was just a really, stunning thing. But, for me, partly just kind of, privately, you sometimes wonder what the student-teacher thing is. And I was, Sterling's teacher for this little period of time, but it's just this little tiny space. It's not, And last night, at different points, just watching him, where he was on stage and he was talking, and I was learning something. I just had the kind of just the most profound feeling of completion. Oh, this is how it works. There's this sort of like there's that Nietzschean idea of what teaching is, which is kind of the student must overcome or kind of master the teacher, and it's rather it's a somewhat violent idea, and it's violent because it implies this hierarchy, that there's like only this one path. And you realize, well, no, there's not. And what teaching is about is leaving people so that they're on their own path and they're speaking from their own place. And I had that feeling last night in this stunning thing, and it was recorded. Anybody who writes should listen to that. It was really amazing about writing and setting it in a really complicated context. So anyway. That's my thank you to Sterling. It was really, really, it's just terrific to me. It was just pure pleasure. And how many of those are there, right? And really moving. One of the things that came up last night was, and this was not what was central, but one of the questions was, I think maybe Sterling asked this, is like, can white people write about Indians, And and one of the things I thought was like, well, I did in here. I mean, I wasn't really writing, the Makah Nation a few years back, I don't know if people followed this, had a whale hunt, and there was this whole crazy, just insane and kind of disappointing kind of civic debate. I was living in Seattle at the time, and it was so dispiriting to hear just the cliches and the viciousness and the secret viciousness. I thought, like people tried to keep that up in their wraps, and all these, it gave liberalism an ugly name, but. And in a minute, and I was thinking, well, maybe I'll read from that. But then I thought, no, because last night's thing was so good. I'm not. It was for me to listen to. I'm not going to try to be in that conversation. It was for me just to hear. I heard something really special. Plus, I talked to my friend Jay. Do you know Jay Choi? Was Jay at, yeah. I talked to my friend Jay before, and I was saying, well, I don't know what to read, and I was thinking maybe should I read that McCarthy? And she was like, it's like, it's like, and she was kind of skeptical at the end. She just said, well, I think you'll decide. You'll make a good decision, And then she said goodbye. She said, good luck, Whitey. So anyway, what I'm going to read, is I wrote an essay called "This Is Living." Specifically, I wanted just to write something new for this publication, and I'm gonna read it. I've never read it out loud, so we'll see how it goes. What can I say about it? I was just trying to, I was trying to write something very simple, but this was so hard for me to do. And I think it is eventually, I think it got simple, but being simple is hard to, and I was taking, the whole process involved, I was taking all these notes, but I couldn't even write them on paper. I was writing them on the back of envelopes, and I've still got them. I've just like stacks of, junk mail envelopes, just like a little scribble here, a little scribble. It was like I couldn't look at the thing directly, I was like, kind of creating my own obliqueness, of approach. But anyway, and then at one point when I sat down to actually write it, kind of begin to kind of write it, it ended up being like 60 pages. And I called a friend and was like, geez, I'm trying to write this essay, but it seems like it's a memoir, It's like, anyway, I finally wrestled it down into the shape that it is, and that's what I'm going to read. Let's see. Ooh. I got this stool here just in case, it's a little bit on the long side. It's not quite that long, but I might want to just like use the stool at different points. So anyway, here we go. This is living. I was 7 and had a leather purse full of silver dollars, both of which, the purse and the coins, I considered valuable. I wanted them stored in the bank. At the time, the bank had an imposing landmark status in my map of the world, in part because it shared the same red brick as the public school, the two most substantial buildings in our town. As a Catholic school kid, I did a lot of fundraising in the form of selling candy bars, Christmas stamps, and fruitcakes. And my favorite spot for doing business was outside the bank on Friday afternoons because that was payday. Working men came to deposit their checks and left the bank with a little cash for the weekend. Today, that ritual is nearly gone, its rhythms broken, except for people on welfare, who still visit banks and pack into lines waiting for tellers the first of every month. But back then, I'd set my box of candy on the sidewalk and greet customers, holding the door for them like a bellhop. Friends of mine with an entirely different outlook on life tried to sell their candy at the grocery store. But I figured that outside the supermarket, people might lie and make excuses, claiming to be broke. But not here, not at the bank, for reasons that seemed obvious to me. This was the headquarters of money. Most of the men were feeling flush and optimistic. Flush because they were getting paid and would soon have money in their pockets. Optimistic because the work week was over and they could forget what they had done for the money. On their way in, I'd ask if they wanted to buy a candy bar, and they'd dip a nod and smile and say with a jaunty promissory confidence that I could catch them on the way out. And I did. I sold candy bars like a fiend. Year after year, I won the plastic Virgin Marys and crucifixes and laminated holy cards that were given away as gifts to the most enterprising sales kids at school. I liked the whole arrangement. On those Friday afternoons and early evenings, I always dressed in my salt and pepper corduroy pants and saddle shoes and a green cardigan, a school uniform that I believe made me as recognizable to the world as a priest in his soutane. And I remember feeling righteous, an acolyte doing God's work or the church's. Money touched everyone in town, quaintly humanizing them, and I enjoyed standing outside the bank at the center of civic life. This was my early education into the idea of money. My hand will always remember the density of those silver dollars, the dead weight as I tumbled them back and forth, the dull clink as the coins touched. The nature of that weight offered a lesson in value too. You knew by a sense of the coin's unique inner gravity that the silver was pure, that it wasn't an alloy. Holding the coin in your palm, you felt the primitive allure of the metal itself, its truth. Years later, I would pay for college by fixing washing machines and dryers. I was a repairman for a company that installed coin-operated machines in apartment buildings and laundromats. We had collectors in the field, men who worked set routes, hitting laundry rooms all over Seattle, emptying the coin boxes into canvas sacks. Late in the afternoon, they returned to the shop and delivered the dirty bags to the counting room. The coins were filthy, turning everything they touched to the lugubrious gray of pencil lead. You see the same graphite stains on the fingertips of people who play slot machines compulsively. The counting room was a dingy, windowless, fortified cement vault in back of the repair shop. Inside was a conveyor belt and a slotted metal chute and a machine for sorting the coins. A woman named Laurel did all the counting. She was thin and pale, and her hair was limp, and she wore black-rimmed glasses and a flowered smock that seemed a peculiarly sad flourish in that colorless place. She was a drudge in the operation, and unconsciously I equated her plain looks with honesty, her weak sexual presence with a lack of guile. Every afternoon, thousands of dollars worth of coins slid across her tray. The metallic droning of the coins was mind-numbing, and yet this woman, hearing the slightest deviation in that monotony, would toggle a switch and stop the belt, poke through the money in the chute, and pluck out the one silver coin, a Mercury dime, a Washington quarter that predated copper-nickel composition, and replace it with one of her own. Thus, in a matter of seconds, she would make between 100 and 1,000% on her investment. One day she invited me into the counting room and demonstrated all of this, tapping a quarter against the tray, trying to teach me the subtle difference between the sound of a standard and a silver coin, and I never thought of her the same afterwards. The racket of those rattling coins was hellish in the confinement of her concrete bunker, but this pallid, dreary woman had a keen ear for that one true thing, the soft, dull sound of silver as it thunked against metal, and she would eventually amass a small fortune in rare and valuable coins. My silver dollars felt like a fortune, assembled and protected and given value by an abiding faith, a loyalty to them. They were Christmas gifts from my father, one for every year of my life. My vague, instinctive resistance to the coins as legal tender, as pure purchasing power, added to their worth. Somehow I knew that I would never spend them, never convert them into baseball cards or Slurpees or rides at the Evergreen State Fair. I didn't view them as vehicles for my desire. They were things in themselves. They held their own fascination. And I knew the continuing life of that fascination depended entirely on taking them out of circulation. As they lost currency, an element of worthlessness thus entered into my idea of money, an aesthetic dimension. I understood that their value increased the more they sank into the past, and because of this, the coins had some of the quality of buried treasure. At that age, I lost things. I broke them or outgrew them. My interests changed, but I guarded those 7 silver dollars jealously, aware of the link between their personal interest to me and their significance in the world. The coins had very little real toy value. I couldn't throw them or use them to improvise scenarios of valor or heroism. I couldn't include anyone else in my play, as I did with my guns and Tonka trucks. I kept the coins in a leather purse that was shaped like a boot, a souvenir my father brought home from a trip to Tucson, where he had presented a paper at an academic conference. The boot zipped shut, and Mexico, the word Mexico, was printed across the sole. I hid the purse in the bottom drawer of my dresser, stuffed beneath clothes I no longer wore. But then there was a moment in which I decided it was time to put the whole thing, the boot-shaped purse and silver dollars both, in the bank. The only times I'd actually been inside the bank were in the company of my father, who, among other things, taught business finance. In back of the bank was the vault, the door a polished steel slab with a spoked wheel such as you might find at the helm of a ship, And inside the vault was my father's safe deposit box. He kept important papers in the box, insurance policies and a few stock certificates that must have had sentimental value as either early or important trades he'd made in his career, because normally a man with my father's acumen would have held the issues in their street name. Also in the box, he kept an ornate silver watch and fob and penknife, a beautiful set stored in a wooden case lined with crushed green velvet. It had belonged to his father, a man I'd never met. My father would set the watch on the table inside the vault and let me play with it while he shuffled through his papers, always telling me that his father had given it to him and that he, in turn, would pass it on to me when the time was right. Imagining that far-off juncture thrilled me, in large part because it implied that my father knew the future and that he had considered my place in it. I had only recently learned to tell time, and my sense of it was shaky. But I would pull the crown and adjust the delicate black hands until they closely matched those of the bank clock. Then I would wind the stem and hold the watch to my ear, listening as the seconds ticked away inside. My father seemed affable and relaxed in the bank, friendly with the tellers and the president alike. He addressed everyone by name. He flirted and joked, walked briskly and with confidence, taking command of the space. His own father had been a bookie and a figure of the Chicago underworld. More than once, my father had seen him viciously beat other men over money, and I would come to understand with time that it had terrified my dad, seeing his father so violent in the conduct of business. As a young boy, he would visit the local precinct, first with my grandmother, then on his own, to bail his father out of jail. Because they were on the take, the police had to make a show of arresting my grandfather periodically, and on those occasions, my father would come to the station, only to find his dad laughing and joking and playing cards with the cops who'd arrested him. My father's early education and money must have given him a glimpse of something savage and hollow in the heart of the system. The shock of that insight took the form of shame, as it does for so many of the sons of immigrants. And so now, as I look back, it makes perfect sense to me that my father's public self glowed in the company of people who did their business legitimately. His passion for securities, and common stock particularly, was where he ultimately acquired his citizenship. In the bank, or on the phone with a broker, or in class teaching others about finance, he acted like a man with the rights and privileges of a native, a status his own father had never fully attained. Funny, charming, seemingly at ease, he became these things the minute he walked through the bank door. He especially loved the buildings that housed the institutions of money, banks among them. The enormous trust implied in the whole system was palpable to him, perhaps because he knew the fragility of it firsthand, how beneath the flirtation and joking, the first names and handshakes, without some essential civil arrangement between people, it could always devolve into brutal beatings. People who knew him in his capacity as a money whiz have told me that he was a genius, and there's no question that he was a very smart man. Whether he was explaining why cigarettes were price inelastic or describing the dissonant notion behind fairly standard ideas of diversification, that you're actually seeking an utter lack of correlation as a form of harmony, you felt the force and elegance of his mind. And at our house, this kind of stuff was table talk. And so what happened with my silver dollars and my shoe purse is a mystery, a moment that I've returned to again and again over the years. The whole thing had the character of a lesson, of something more than a simple transaction. Put plainly, this is how I remember it. My father and I drove to the bank and stood in line and waited for a teller. When it was our turn, I reached up and stuck my shoe on the counter, which was about level with my chin. My father had instructed me at lunch that I would do all the talking, and we had even rehearsed the lines. So I said to the woman that I wanted to put my purse and silver dollars in the bank. Even to this day, I can see myself standing there. I know the hour, the weather outside as seen through the bank's high windows, the slight feeling of confusion, the hesitance as I wondered if my words were making sense, the coldness at my temples where a faint doubt registered. My father exchanged a glance with the teller, and I looked back over my shoulder at the vault. And when he asked me if I was sure, I said yes, because that was our script. That was the story we had rehearsed and agreed to tell. The teller did her work and then handed me back my empty shoe and a green savings book. At this point, I was so flustered that I couldn't summon the courage to tell her what I was thinking, that the shoe was part of it, that I wanted my leather boot in the bank too. Naturally, when I went to retrieve the silver dollars, they were gone. I was devastated when I was handed instead 7 ordinary dollar bills. I felt rooked. All the alchemy of imagination that had brought me to the bank, that had enlarged the idea of those silver dollars, was undone. What has remained curious to me over the years is why my father didn't see what was happening and intervene. He had all the savvy. Well, in some ways, my idea of the bank was based on the banks in old westerns. For me, it was a place where people stored money and where outlaws could grab it if clever or brutal enough. The bank kept money safe. It was the physical place. It was the vault with the polished steel door. It was the safe deposit box in which I'd store my silver dollars beside the watch and fob that would one day be mine when the time was right. Most of all, the bank was where my father and I spent some of our best days, the rare place where I saw him happy and at home, his private and increasingly troubled and violent self set aside in favor of the public man who was upright and worthy and could stride across the carpet to shake the president's hand. It seems so obvious to me, it seems so obvious now, but ultimately that's what I was investing in when I decided to put my silver dollars in the bank, that future with my father. Our business at the bank finished, we took a walk. Town was only 1 block long, but my father was dressed for Michigan Avenue, dapper in his wingtips, navy blue blazer, and the sort of rakish flat cap favored by Southern Italians. I wore dungarees and leather boots and a green flannel shirt from Penny's. I kept a native's eye on the Sammamish, where sockeye ran in the fall, flashing red in the slow murk of the slough, and a disused granary that rumor said was full of rats. But to my father, that beckoning world was terra incognita. And at the corner, already impatient, the maiden drag used up, he steered me across the street, leading us toward what we called our secret destination. It was fun to play along with my father in this conspiracy, to hold this secret in common, though we'd both known all along exactly where the day would end. We were going to the bakery, and we were going to eat chocolate cake. On the way there, my father mentioned that when he was a boy, he had a favorite uncle who gave him a Morgan silver dollar every Christmas. He didn't need to explain to me that the 7 Morgans I just put in the bank were the direct descendants of that distant gesture. "Where's your uncle now?" I asked. "I'm not sure," my father said. And then, in a way that registered very strangely to me, he added, "He was unmarried." I didn't know what my father meant, but I never forgot what he said. My ear seized on the distortion, heard the lurch in logic, the faltering fact, unmarried. He seemed to have answered a question I hadn't asked, drawing on a depth that was wholly private. Briefly, he was alone. In the worshiping eyes of a son, any father's life is epic, I suppose, but nothing in my father's life ever approached the coherence of narrative. He was, I know, a proud and high-minded man, but with the kind of rigid pride and impossible rectitude that's a form of suppression, an immigrant son's pride, the triumphant pride, namely, of having overcome the past. In his epic life, the trail of evidence was scant, the facts meager and few. An odd scattering of fragments and then a vast surrounding silence. That unmarried uncle was one such fragment, but my father would return to this uncle so often, feeding off the same thin fact, that I began to collect the pieces, storing them up as zealously as I guarded my silver dollars. And so in time, this one false note, this strange detail, this favorite uncle, this unmarried uncle eventually acquired a name. He was Chris. He was Uncle Chris, an Uncle Chris who lived alone in a single room, a room that was spare and clean, a small cheap room in a flop house on Chicago's near west side. And one day, a winter day, my grandfather, Antonio D'Ambrosio, viciously beat his brother and left him, this brother, this Uncle Chris, the giver of silver dollars, bloody and unconscious in a hillock of dirty snow beneath the ale tracks at Argyle. The Argyle L stop served as my grandfather's front. And all through elementary school, my father, always a go-getter, worked the counter in the afternoons and on weekends. In his mind, the front was the family business, a father and son operation, and it was his job to hustle commuter sundries, all the newspapers, magazines, cigarettes, gum, and candy that would show sufficient income on my grandfather's modest but fraudulent tax returns. I saw him beat the living daylights out of my uncle, my father would tell me years later, in language that had never escaped 1944. It was ugly, he said. I ran, he said. I ran the hell out of there. I ran all the way to the lake, and with a dismissive wave of his hand, he shut the story down, a thing beyond words, pointless to try. What can you say? He ran, and it was winter, and in his fear, he'd fled without his coat. Now, whenever I visit Chicago, I make the same run myself, chasing after my father, I suppose, pursuing him all the way down Argyle, crossing the outer drive until I, too, hit the lake. My father doesn't know I do this, and he probably wouldn't care or even understand. And really, I have no idea why this lunatic errand matters to me. Beyond the foolish belief that one of these days, when I reach the lake, I'll find him. I mean, literally find him, still there, an 11-year-old boy, cold and alone, with nowhere else to run. Late at night, my grandfather would crush saltine crackers in a coffee mug and fill it with cold milk. That was his favorite snack, and the sweetest memory my father ever shared with me. Whenever I imagine it, I'm right there with him, looking over his shoulder in some half-lit, long-ago kitchen, watching a boy watch a man he loves spoon a gruel of milk and saltines into his mouth as he totes the vig on a loan or reads over the race results in the Chicago Tribune, tallying up the winners he'll pay off and the losers whose money he'll pocket. I have a somewhat desperate need to witness the scene and to know my father had that love, that small store of tenderness in his memory. My grandfather worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and then 7 during World War II when so many horses ran at Mexican tracks. He went to sleep at 2 a.m. He woke at 8 a.m. It would be ran at tracks in Mexico, I think. Anyway, too late for that. Mexican track. What's a Mexican track? You know, it's like, he rarely attended church, but he tithed and then some. Always the single largest contributor to St. Thomas of Canterbury's coffers, back in the days when those numbers were brazenly published in church bulletins. In a bookie's universe, cash flows constantly, and then there's the siphoning. His front at the Argyle stop was prime real estate, and it's unlikely that the cops at the local precinct were the only people he greased. In that era on the north side of Chicago, he would have answered to Jaime Weiss, Bugs Morand, and later Paul Ricca, heir to the Capone syndicate. I find it much harder to imagine the intricacies of my father's confusion as he walked to the precinct, suddenly the man of the house, an envelope of cash in his pocket. Once he had the drill down, once he realized he wouldn't find his father behind bars, in prison stripes, guarded by men with drawn guns, it only took him 10 minutes to make his dad's bail. The sham arrests kept the record straight, but the hero of the story was cash. Cash was magic. Cash was powerful. Cash was the savior. Although I imagine the short walk home was conducted in silence, after all, this was just another day on the job, I suspect that in some tacit but troubled agreement, an economist was busy being born. I can guess what my father would say now, belatedly filling the silence. And here's my weak imitation of his mind at work. To legitimize an illegal business such as bookmaking, you needed the approbation of the law, or at least the approval of the people who enforce the law. Those enforcers grant the bookmaker a license that isn't legally theirs to give, but which, by virtue of their position, they have the power to create or destroy at whim. The law enforcers charge a fee for the mythical but economically significant license, and to protect both themselves and the licensee, they create an insurance policy issued to the bookie that provides ongoing protection for the life of the illegal business. Neither the insurance and its protections nor the license are free. There is a cost to everything, There are no free lunches. Of course, graft and corruption and gambling make a grab at the free lunch, and the D'Ambrosios did more than okay in America. They owned their 6 flat outright. My father was enrolled in a fine Jesuit academy and was meeting Catholic swells from all around the city. And he had at his disposal a new black Buick with a Necker's knob on the steering wheel, which allowed him to coolly turn a corner and squeeze a date's thigh at the same time. Then, in 1950, Antonio D'Ambrosio dropped dead of a heart attack on the sidewalk outside his Argyle front. He was 52 years old. In the box on his death certificate for usual occupation, my grandfather was listed as proprietor, and in the box for kind of business, a clerk neatly printed cigar store. He passed away a month after my father finished high school. I know nothing about those days except that my father had the key to a safe deposit box, and at the bank, when he was alone in the vault, in the quiet of the armored walls, with the day gate locked, he turned the key, opened the box, and found $100,000 cash. Or, in today's dollars, my father turned that key and opened the lid on $1 million. That, as my father would say, is a nice chunk of change. My father didn't want the burden, particularly the burden of his mother, my grandmother, who beat him pitilessly with a broom handle all through his boyhood. The broom treatment, he called it, without any elaboration. It's not very hard for me to imagine that those beatings did all the things beatings do to people. Still, the moment he turned the key and opened the safe deposit box, his career in finance was determined. And my grandmother would live off the money, conservatively managed by her son, for the next 36 years. The bookie's boy went legit, breaking with his father, and yet a good son, kept his hand in a world whose faded narcotic action is gambling's kissing cousin. Instead of handicapping horses, he played the market, trading racing sheets for value line, and his career in finance was, in some ways, an apology, a defense for a life of crime. That early death broke my father, dividing him from his past. But the heavy tectonics of one of our most cherished immigrant myths, that each new generation will surpass the previous, did a lot of the heaving and sundering too. It's a brutal business, making Americans. As soon as he finished his dissertation, looking for a fresh start, my father found a job in a world as remote from Chicago as he could imagine, in a place neither he nor anyone in his family could really picture, and was carried along on the buoyant currents of yet another American myth, moving as far west as he could go and still be standing on the continental U.S. Which brings us to our secret destination. Warm from the sun, warm from the ovens, warm from the smell of rising yeast and freshly baked bread, all this safe and sleepy warmth was a kind of quiet. And in that white-tiled Dutch bakery, my father's voice, I remember, boomed a little too loudly, waking the place to life. He tapped the counter bell, and when a stout woman with her hair in a snood appeared, my father was already reaching deep into his pocket. As sophisticated as he was about every manner of financial instrument, cash was where it was at. Cash was holy. In all of his life, my father kept bricks of it, bills strapped at the bank, stored in a safe at home. His stash, he called it. He always had to have his stash. And whenever he plunged his hand into his left pocket, it was time for ostentation. He'd stretch his arms out to clear his cuffs, hold his gaudy gold money clip chest high, lick his fingers and flick through the bills, a C note on the outside, of course, implying wealth in a fat wad that might in fact hide a poor truth that the bulk of the bankroll was made up of singles. Then he'd snap off 1, 2, 3 bills, whatever was needed. This wasn't the father with the doctoral dissertation on railroad economics. This was someone else. This was my father in his fluency, flashing his cash and slapping a sawbuck on the counter as if we were back in Chicago, maybe the Empire Room at the Palmer House, and not a bakery in the boonies on a Saturday afternoon. I watched the whole performance from a tiny table by the window. We'd done our business at the bank, and now we each had a big piece of chocolate layer cake, thick with icing. It was yellow cake. I don't know how they got it yellow, but they did, and the yellow was beautiful against the warm brown frosting. We loved that chocolate cake. This was a good day, a really good day, and I knew what was coming next. My father stared for a long time out the window. At what, I don't know. But I waited for his famous phrase, sure it would come. And then when his reverie broke and he returned to the bakery and our little table, he smiled at me, then looked down at his cake, and there it was, sure as rain. This is living, he said. Huh, Charlie boy? This is living. Take a break here, some water. Lots of things were living, mostly food, cannoli, salami, you know. Little break. Of course, the past followed him out west. And now we're jumping ahead here a little bit, obviously, but of course, the past followed him out west. And now we had our own history, easily as troubled as the one he'd left behind in Chicago and far more violent. Every time I visited my father, I was certain it would be the last. Months would go by, even a year, and I wouldn't know whether he was dead or alive. And then I would see a sign, a leaf falling just so, a plastic sack blowing through an empty intersection. And corny as these omens were, the spookiness was real to me, always there, lurking below the surface of my days, and would haunt and harass me until the only cure was to call him again. Or I'd pay him a visit after dwelling on some silly, old, odd, obscure chain of memory. Other times, I'd show up intending business, bringing a family grievance to the table. He'd sent my sister a letter smeared with his blood. He tried to sell his mentally ill son a cemetery plot. He'd shown up at several of my readings wearing a Chicago Cubs hat dangling with fishing lures, a crown of thorns fashioned from spinners and spoons and treble-hooked crankbaits. And then he just stood there, 30 feet away, staring and saying nothing while I signed books, in a grotesque martyrdom that I somehow understood. One day I was drinking coffee on a bench in Victor Steinbrook Park at the north end of the public market next to a Japanese man who was reading what I believed to be a biography of Hitler. The title was Hitler, anyway. His son sat between us, a little boy of roughly 4. He was bored and antsy, pestering his father with questions that went unanswered. What year did you first exist in, Daddy? When did you first come alive? In his frustration, the boy kept trying to close the book, slapping at it and mussing the pages, and the father kept pushing him away. I finished my coffee and walked to the south end of the market and called my father from a payphone outside De Laurenti's, an Italian grocery, asking if he'd eaten. He hadn't. I bought spaghetti and meatballs, buffalo mozzarella, and roasted peppers, green olives stuffed with pimentos, and a jar of hot pepperoncini. Indulgences out of his past, hoping the feast might provoke the old famous phrase. But the food didn't matter. Nothing in this world seemed to matter anymore. Instead, he kept referring to the mystics, as if in fact those mystics were in the room. As the mystics tell us, he would say, all is well, all is well. In rejecting the material world, he seemed to have found an alibi, an elsewhere, glorying in a triumph that was hard for me to hear. He would eventually make himself destitute, giving all his money, every scrimped nickel, to the Catholic Church, becoming a ward of the diocese. This contemptus mundi included his kids. He wanted it known that he did not need us for his happiness, did not need us at all. He no longer spoke to any of his 7 children. He rarely left his apartment. He was a physical mess, obese, wheezing, unable to lift himself from his chair without tremendous exertion. Now and then I could see the old fire in my father's eyes, and with the urgency of some thought roiling inside him, he would struggle forward, but he seemed trapped in his body, wholly bound by his physical decline. The great and engaging brilliance and the passion that had made it so infectious and forceful was struggling, it seemed, toward an apophatic mysticism, negating facts and fiction and emptying itself of pride in all its projects. He was done with all those corrupt and violent appetites, but alone, divested of business and free of family, the unknowing was agonized. After we'd eaten, as I washed and dried dishes and the hard rain whipped against the windows, my father said, "You know, I've never been to the rainforest. Isn't that a hell of a thing?" It seemed terrible to have come so close to the ocean and never set foot in the Pacific, as if his journey west were never completed. But when I offered to drive him out to the coast, he waved me off. As the desert fathers tell us, he said, "All is well, all is well." At the end of that night, he led me down the hall to a closet and gave me what remained of a box of red pens and asked me if I wanted his old safe. It was beige, about the size of a milk crate, and weighed at least 100 pounds. I took it. I said yes, just because he'd spent the night renouncing the world, trying to let go, and I felt that I might offend his pride by refusing his parting gift. I carried the safe down the corridor and sat on it, breathing hard, while I waited for the elevator. It was one of those nights in Seattle when the wind downtown was strong enough to blow flower pots off the decks of high-rises, and the traffic signals danced a crazy tarantella over the empty intersections. The streets down there were always drifting with deranged characters, but that night even people with nowhere to go had found somewhere to go. The weight of the safe was ponderous and uncooperative, too heavy to hoist on my shoulder for long, impossibly awkward to carry in front of me. The die-cast edges cut my fingers, and it took me forever to lurch and waddle the 5 blocks home. Every 50 feet or so, I dropped the safe on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. Then I'd sit on it and roll a cigarette, smoking in the rain. I wondered if passing cops would think I was a thief in an inept heist, making it an even more pathetic getaway. I wish I could say that I did the sensible thing, ditching the safe in a dumpster or abandoning it on someone's stoop, but I didn't. I carried it as far as I possibly could. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was too wet and miserable and exhausted to haul the safe up the stairs, and I had no use for it anyway. I didn't have the combination, and I didn't own anything valuable. I left the safe in the alley behind my building, in a patch of dirt beneath a tall cedar, and it stayed there for a long time. No one took it because it was heavy and it was empty. And then one morning I looked out my window and it was gone. That's it. Thank you. Really, I saw in my little the description of what I'm supposed to be doing here that I might answer some questions. But would I please?
Would you please answer a question?
Sure, yeah, I would, yeah. On the other hand, it's really hot in here. Some people might just want to scram, and I'm fine with that too. You scrammers want to go, or you got something better to do, which I hope you do, But anyway, are there any questions? Go ahead.
In your introduction, the idea of dog was brought up, and I was curious if you could talk about what that means in the writing process. Embracing doubt, not embracing doubt.
Yeah, kind of in a practical level, I feel like, well, one of the things about doubt is that, I know that my ignorance is the larger part of me. And it always will be. It's like this vast terrain. The little bit that I do know is kind of minuscule. So I rely on just like a feeling of kind of my uncertainty and my doubt and the unknown and in my ability to kind of face that and then I like being thrown back on myself and to discover, well, what do I know? So that's my kind of personal, take on it. But I also think that, for the art of the essay, let's say, if the essay can be an art, and I think it can be, right? I mean, but it puts the essay as an art on the opposite end of the spectrum from the way we all get taught. I'm not, saying that our teachers are evil, but we begin in first grade with our early book reports. We develop these heavy-duty expository habits, and they're all about explaining the world. And I don't think, where's the mystery in that? But we feel the burden of it. So doubt and uncertainty, the things that we can explain, the things that no one has ever been able to explain. That's how you kind of know if you have a good subject. Those kind of mysteries that never will get resolved completely are kind of what, kind of to me make a good personal essay, come to life. As well as good, lots of other good things too. Does that kind of...
That's great.
Is that kind of like roundabout, or that's all? That's the best I can do, roundabout. It's just very energizing. I often don't do, for the most part, I don't do any research. There are one or two pieces where I've actually gone on research, but I kind of like to know, it's kind of the kind of Montaigne, sort of question, what do I know? And what do I know right now? And kind of going, I've read a lot, I've thought a lot. So of course it's not like, I'm a complete ignoramus. But it's interesting to see what you can kind of discover just by going into those blank spaces, or what you think are blank spaces, and what you can haul out, and and not try to be an expert about everything. There's so much energy in that, I think. So, yeah.
In the introduction, he finished with a wonderful phrase where he said the students would talk about publishing, and then you say, I believe that's not what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So you personally, as a writer, do you have a goal with your essays? What are you trying to do? Because it's beautiful what you've done, but do you have...
Yeah. Yeah, I think the to kind of revisit that, what we're trying to do is write. And publishing is a kind of it's a byproduct of that activity, but it is a byproduct. And also, what Sterling was talking about is this really pretentious room at Michigan at the Hopwood, and they have this big table, and it's mounded like you can't put a coffee cup down. It's mounded with literary journals, and you're talking across this mound of journals. Rightly, it just feels absurd, and plus you're looking at all these literary journals and think, okay, well, there's no mystery here. Anyone who puts a few words and gets most of them in the right order is going to end up in one of these journals in this pile on this table. So it's not even like a worthy ambition. So that's what I think right. That's kind of what we were thinking. So, but in the act of writing, you're trying to kind of, I wanted to, actually this began very simply, and I wanted to say, it was, my father was a very tough man to be around and not just for me, because I don't want to whine about myself, although I will, but, for my mother and my brothers and sisters, part of the hardest thing for me was the witnessing of treatment of others and feeling powerless in the face of it. But I was the oldest, and I wanted to start with a good memory. I had to dig back, go way back, and kind of honor what I have to honor. It's not a particularly rah-rah story, but so I was trying to get to that and to say it with the simplest lines I possibly could. And this, it got published in this book, but it wasn't, I don't think it's anywhere else. So, but that was okay. Doing it. It was autotelic. It was its own reward, the activity, Yeah.
In the introduction to loitering, you talk about leaving things almost intentionally unfinished or rough and raw.
Yeah.
I think that might follow up a little on the doubt. Would you be willing to say anything about that?
Yeah. It's not true of kind of every, there are a range of different kinds of essays, and some are kind of a little bit more on the kind of lyric and polished side and quieter, and some are just kind of rough, where I kind of leave, when I hit places where I don't know what I'm talking about, I just say I don't know what I'm talking about in a certain kind of way, you know. I don't then, you know, kind of go out and patch it up by, you know, kind of researching and then pretending that I knew. I mean, I just, you know, I kind of just leave it kind of rough. Or you know, I feel like a lot of times I'll say something and then I'll immediately begin questioning it, you know, and just kind of leave a kind of, really what you're, you know, in a lot of these, what I'm trying to capture is the drama of someone thinking about the problem. And so I want the drama on the page, you know, with all its doubts, its twists, its turns, its uncertainty, its failings, you know, the ridiculous things I say, you know, it's all about that drama rather than kind of finishing delivering a finished kind of position piece about some matter, you know. I think that's, yeah. Anything else?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all.